Tonight, we'll walk together through the stone halls of medieval monasteries, where silence was golden and solitude was sacred. Let yourself settle into comfort as we explore a world where the rhythm of prayer bells marked each passing hour, where men sought God through deprivation, and where the human spirit was tested in ways that might drive the modern mind to the very edge of sanity. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine yourself stepping through heavy wooden doors into a realm where time moved differently, where every breath was measured against eternity, and where the greatest battles were fought not with swords, but within the chambers of the human heart. Daily life immersion, the monastic routine. The bell tolls at 2 in the morning, its bronze voice cutting through the darkness like a blade through silk. You wake not to the gentle embrace of dawn, but to the harsh reality of matins, the first of 8 daily prayer services that will punctuate your existence with the regularity of a heartbeat. Around you, 30 other men stir on their straw mattresses, their breath visible in the cold air of the dormitory. There are no individual cells here. Privacy is a luxury that God's servants have willingly abandoned. Your feet touch the cold stone floor, and you feel the familiar shock that never quite becomes comfortable. The monastery provides rough woolen socks, but they offer little protection against the perpetual chill that seems to seep from the very walls. You dress quickly in the darkness, the same brown or black habit you've worn for years, patched and repatched until it bears more resemblance to a patchwork quilt than a garment. The rope belt cinches around your waist, and you adjust the hood that will become your constant companion, shielding your face from the world and the world from your increasingly hollow gaze. The chapel awaits, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows across stone walls blackened by centuries of smoke. You take your place in the choir stalls, wooden seats worn smooth by generations of monks who have sat here before you, their prayers rising like incense toward the vaulted ceiling. The Latin words flow from your lips automatically now. Domine, labia mea aperis. Lord, you will open my lips. How many times have you spoken these words? 10,000? 20,000? The numbers blur together like the faces of your brothers, all equally gaunt, all equally devoted, all equally trapped in this sacred prison. 2 hours pass in prayer and psalms. Your knees ache against the hard wood of the kneeler, but you dare not shift. Brother Marcus, the cantor, watches from the corner of his eye, ready to note any sign of weakness, any deviation from the perfect submission that monastic life demands. When matins finally ends, you return to your mattress for 2 precious hours of sleep before Lauds calls you back to the chapel at dawn. This is your existence, day after day, season after season. After Lauds comes prime at 6, terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3, vespers at 6, and finally compline at 8. 8 services that divide your day into fragments, each one beginning and ending in the same stone chapel, under the same watchful eyes of carved saints whose painted expressions have long since faded to spectral shadows. Between these services you work. The monastery is a world unto itself, and every aspect of survival depends on the labor of your hands. You might find yourself bent over manuscripts in the scriptorium, carefully copying texts in the dim light that filters through narrow windows. Your fingers are permanently stained with ink, your back curved from hours of hunching over parchment. The work is meticulous, demanding. A single mistake in copying a biblical text could damn souls, or so you've been told. The pressure is immense, the concentration required absolute. Or perhaps you labor in the kitchen, where the same thin gruel is prepared day after day. Bread, porridge, vegetables from the monastery garden, meat only on feast days, and then only the coarsest cuts. You learn to find sustenance in monotony, to extract meaning from the endless repetition of simple tasks. The kitchen fires provide warmth, but they also fill the air with smoke that makes your eyes water and your throat burn. Your hands are raw from scrubbing stone floors and wooden bowls, from kneading bread dough and stirring great cauldrons of soup. The silence. The silence. The rule of St. Benedict speaks of silence as a virtue, but living within it becomes a form of slow torture. You develop a sign language with your brothers, subtle gestures that convey basic needs without breaking the sacred quiet. But human thoughts, human emotions, human desires, these cannot be communicated through hand signals. They build up inside you like water behind a dam, pressing against the walls of your consciousness with increasing force. You begin to notice things. The way Brother Thomas's eye twitches when he's struggling with temptation, the slight tremor in Brother Francis's hands during prayer, the way Brother Andrew sometimes mouths words to himself when he thinks no one is watching. These become your entertainment, your connection to the humanity that still beats within these brown robes. You start to catalog these observations to create stories about your brother's inner lives, because your own inner life has become too dangerous to explore. The food begins to taste like ash in your mouth, not because it's poorly prepared, but because the pleasure of eating, like all pleasures, has been systematically eliminated from your existence. You eat to survive, you work to serve, you pray to obey. The triangle of your existence becomes smaller and smaller until you feel as though you're living in a cell even when you're standing in the great hall. Sleep becomes your only escape, but even that is regulated. You sleep when the bell allows, wake when the bell demands. Your dreams become increasingly vivid, increasingly strange. You dream of the world outside these walls, of women you've never met, of foods you've never tasted, of freedoms you've never known. You wake from these dreams feeling more imprisoned than ever, as if your unconscious mind is mocking your conscious choice to be here. This is the rhythm of monastic life, not the gentle, contemplative existence that drew you here, but a grinding, relentless machine that processes human souls like grain between millstones. Day after day, year after year, the same prayers, the same work, the same silent meals, the same stone walls closing in around you like a tomb for the living. Biography, Brother Adelard's Descent. Let us follow the journey of one particular monk, Brother Adelard, whose story illuminates the gradual erosion of sanity that monastery life could impose upon even the most devout soul. Adelard came to the monastery of St. Dunstan in the autumn of 1247, a young man of 22 winters, his heart burning with religious fervor and his mind sharp with the learning he had acquired in the Cathedral School of Winchester. His family had been wealthy merchants, and Adelard had known comfort, soft beds, rich foods, the companionship of friends, and the possibility of marriage and children. But a dream, or what he believed to be a divine vision, had called him to abandon these worldly pleasures for the higher calling of monastic life. He approached the monastery gates with the confidence of youth, certain that his sacrifice would be rewarded with spiritual enlightenment and a closer relationship with the divine. The first year passed in what Adelard would later remember as a kind of honeymoon period. The novelty of the routine, the sense of purpose that came from complete devotion, the camaraderie he felt with his fellow novices, all of this sustained him through the initial hardships. His body adapted to the poor food and the cold stone floors. His mind found comfort in the repetitive nature of the prayers, the way the Latin words seemed to wash over him like a gentle river, carrying away the concerns and anxieties of his former life. But as the seasons turned and the second year began, subtle changes started to manifest in Adelard's behavior and thoughts. The prayers that had once filled him with peace began to feel mechanical, empty. He found himself reciting the words while his mind wandered to memories of his former life, or worse, to imaginings of the life he might have lived. During the long hours of manuscript copying, he would catch himself staring at the same line for minutes at a time, unable to focus on the sacred text before him. The isolation began to affect him more profoundly. In his previous life, Adelard had been gregarious, quick to laugh, and eager to engage in conversation. The enforced silence of the monastery pressed upon him like a physical weight. He began to have conversations with himself, elaborate internal dialogues that grew more complex and more necessary as the months passed. Sometimes he would catch himself moving his lips during these silent conversations, earning sharp looks from the brothers around him. Sleep became elusive. The hard straw mattress, once merely uncomfortable, now seemed to torture his increasingly thin frame. He would lie awake for hours, listening to the breathing of his brothers, counting the sounds of their shifting and turning. In these dark hours his mind would race with thoughts that felt increasingly foreign to his nature, angry thoughts about the abbot's harsh punishments, resentful thoughts about the better treatment afforded to certain favored brothers, and most disturbing of all, lustful thoughts about the women he had known in his previous life. By the third year, Adelard's condition had deteriorated markedly. His fellow monks began to notice his strange behaviors, the way he would sometimes stop mid-step in the corridor, as if listening to voices they could not hear, or the way he would smile at inappropriate moments during solemn prayers. During meals he would arrange his food in peculiar patterns, turning his bread crust into geometric shapes or lining up his vegetables in perfect rows. These small rituals seemed to give him comfort, but they also marked him as someone whose mind was no longer entirely his own. The breaking point came during the fourth year, on a grey February morning when the weight of winter seemed to press down upon the monastery like a great stone. Adelard was working in the scriptorium, copying a passage from the Book of Psalms, when he suddenly threw down his quill and began to laugh, Not the quiet chuckle that might escape a monk who had found an amusing passage, but a wild, uncontrolled laughter that echoed through the stone chamber like the cry of a trapped animal. Brother Francis, who was working at the adjacent desk, looked up in alarm as Adelard's laughter grew louder and more desperate. The young monk was now standing, his face red with exertion, his hands clutching at his brown habit as if trying to tear it from his body. "Can you not hear them?" he gasped between fits of laughter. "They're singing! The stones are singing!" The other monks in the scriptorium stopped their work and stared as Adelard began to dance, if his jerky, uncontrolled movements could be called dancing. He spun in circles, his arms extended, his head thrown back as he listened to music that existed only in his fractured mind. "Such beautiful music," he cried out. "Why do we not join the song? Why do we sit in silence when the very walls cry out in praise?" Brother Francis rose from his desk and approached cautiously, his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "Brother Adelard," he said softly, "there is no music. You must calm yourself." But Adelard's response was to laugh even harder, the sound now taking on an edge of hysteria. "No music?" he shrieked. "How can you not hear it?" "It's been playing for months. Every night, every day, the stones sing and the manuscripts whisper, and the very air thrums with God's voice. You've all gone deaf from your piety." The abbot was summoned, and with him came two of the stronger brothers. They found Adelard sitting in the corner of the scriptorium, his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth while muttering in a mixture of Latin and his native tongue. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and devotion, now held a glazed quality that spoke of a mind that had retreated from the unbearable pressure of his circumstances. "Brother," the abbot said gently, kneeling beside the broken young man, "you must return to your duties. This behavior is not befitting a servant of God." Adelard looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see through him rather than at him. "Duties?" he whispered. "I have been performing my duties perfectly, Father. I have been praying every prayer, working every day, keeping every silence. But the duties, they have duties of their own. They grow and multiply and demand more and more until there is nothing left of the man who once chose to perform them." The abbot recognized the signs. He had seen them before in other monks whose minds had been unable to bear the weight of monastic life. Adelard was taken to a small cell in the monastery's infirmary, where he spent his remaining days in a state of peaceful madness, convinced that he was in direct communication with various saints and angels who visited him regularly. He would conduct elaborate conversations with these invisible visitors, discussing theology and philosophy with an eloquence that sometimes surpassed his sanity. He died 5 years later at the age of 31, his body worn out by the privations of monastic life and his mind finally at peace in its constructed reality. The brothers who prepared his body for burial noted that his hands were still stained with ink from his years in the scriptorium, and that he had worn smooth grooves in the stone floor of his cell from his constant pacing. Adelard's story was not unique. The monastery records, carefully maintained by successive generations of scribes, contain numerous accounts of brothers who had succumbed to what they termed melancholia, or spiritual confusion, euphemisms for the mental breakdown that claimed a significant portion of those who attempted to live according to the harsh demands of medieval monastic life. The irony was not lost on those who remained sane enough to perceive it. In seeking to purify their souls through the elimination of worldly pleasures and human connection, many monks had created conditions that were far more hellish than anything the outside world could offer. The road to heaven, it seemed, was paved with the broken minds of those who had tried too hard to walk it. Mystery and culture, the forbidden knowledge. Within the thick stone walls of medieval monasteries lay secrets that would have astonished the simple peasants who provided the grain and vegetables that sustained monastic life. Beyond the public face of prayer and piety, many monasteries harbored libraries containing texts that challenged the very foundations of Christian doctrine, manuscripts that had been saved from destruction not out of scholarly interest, but out of a darker fascination with forbidden knowledge. Brother Joachim, the librarian of the monastery at Melrose, knew the location of every dangerous volume in his collection. Hidden behind false walls and concealed within innocent-looking religious texts were works that could have resulted in excommunication, or worse, if discovered by the wrong eyes. There were copies of ancient Greek philosophical texts that questioned the nature of reality itself, Arabic treatises on mathematics and astronomy that suggested the earth was not the center of God's creation, and most dangerous of all, heretical Christian texts that proposed alternative interpretations of Christ's teachings. The psychological effect of guarding such knowledge was profound. Imagine spending your days copying passages from the approved church fathers while knowing that, hidden just a few shelves away, lay texts that systematically dismantled every certainty your faith was built upon. The cognitive dissonance was maddening, to be simultaneously the guardian and the prisoner of truths that could never be spoken aloud. Some monks found themselves drawn to these forbidden texts like moths to flame. Brother Anselm, a skilled copyist, began secretly transcribing passages from a Greek text on natural philosophy during his assigned hours in the scriptorium. The work was supposedly a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, but hidden within its margins, written in a cipher known only to a few initiates, were discussions of atomic theory and the possibility of other worlds beyond the one described in Genesis. The intellectual stimulation was intoxicating after years of mindless repetition. Anselm's secret studies gave him a sense of purpose and discovery that had been absent from his monastic routine, but they also filled him with a growing sense of alienation from his brothers, who continued their daily prayers and labors unaware that their entire worldview rested on foundations that might be built on sand. The monastery's culture of secrecy extended beyond forbidden books to forbidden practices. Archaeological evidence from excavated monastery sites reveals artifacts that suggest certain communities engaged in rituals that would have been considered deeply heretical by church authorities. Strange symbols carved into stone floors, hidden chambers beneath altars, and most disturbing of all, evidence of experiments that seem to blur the line between prayer and what later ages would call magic. Brother Dunstan, the monastery's herbalist, maintained a garden that officially grew plants for medicine and cooking, but hidden among the rows of sage and rosemary were other plants, herbs that induced visions, flowers that could cause hallucinations, roots that could bring on states of consciousness that the brothers interpreted as divine revelation. The knowledge of these plants had been passed down through generations of monastic healers, preserved in coded texts that disguised botanical instruction as theological commentary. The use of these substances created a secret society within the monastery, brothers who shared experiences that they could never discuss openly. They would meet in the herb garden at night, under the pretense of tending to sick plants, and share preparations that transported them to realms of consciousness that seemed to offer direct communication with the divine. But these experiences came at a cost. The brothers who partook regularly began to lose their grip on ordinary reality, becoming increasingly unable to distinguish between their visions and their waking life. The monastery's approach to dealing with mental illness revealed another layer of its hidden culture. Rather than treating disturbed brothers as medical cases, the community often interpreted their symptoms as signs of either divine favor or demonic possession. This led to a complex system of spiritual diagnosis that could either elevate a mad monk to the status of a holy visionary or condemn him to brutal exorcism rituals. Brother Aldrich, whose mind had been shattered by years of severe fasting and sleep deprivation, was declared to be experiencing mystical visions when he began speaking in tongues during the evening prayers. His incoherent ravings were carefully transcribed by Brother Joachim and studied for hidden meanings. The fact that Aldrich's prophecies were merely the product of a starving brain was never considered. Instead, he was treated as a living saint, his every word treasured as divine revelation. This elevation of madness to mysticism created a perverse incentive within the monastery. Brothers who observed the special treatment accorded to the holy mad sometimes began to mimic symptoms of mental breakdown, hoping to escape the grinding routine of normal monastic life. They would fast to the point of hallucination, deprive themselves of sleep until they began to see visions, and engage in extreme physical penances that pushed their bodies and minds to the breaking point. The result was a community where the line between sanity and madness became increasingly blurred. Brothers who maintained their rational faculties began to question whether they were failing in their spiritual duties. If God truly spoke to the mad, then perhaps sanity itself was a form of spiritual weakness. This paradox drove many monks to deliberately seek out the very mental destruction that the monastic life seemed designed to produce. The monastery's architecture itself contributed to this culture of hidden knowledge and psychological extremism. Secret passages connected different parts of the building, allowing for clandestine meetings and the movement of forbidden materials. The walls contained hidden niches where dangerous texts could be concealed, and the floors were riddled with crypts and underground chambers that served purposes far removed from simple burial. Most disturbing of all were the discoveries made in the 20th century, when many of these monasteries were excavated by archaeologists. Beneath the altar of one medieval monastery, researchers found a chamber containing hundreds of small bones arranged in complex geometric patterns. The bones were human, but their arrangement suggested rituals that had nothing to do with Christian burial practices. Similar discoveries at other sites revealed a pattern of secret activities that would have horrified the church authorities who believed they were overseeing simple communities of prayer and labor. The psychological impact of living within such a web of secrets and forbidden knowledge was profound. Monks found themselves leading double lives, publicly pious and privately struggling with doubts and forbidden desires that their clandestine studies had awakened. The very act of hiding their true thoughts and interests from their brothers created a level of paranoia and isolation that compounded the already severe psychological stresses of monastic life. This culture of secrecy also meant that monks who were suffering from mental illness received little effective help. Their symptoms were either ignored, misinterpreted as spiritual phenomena, or treated with harsh disciplinary measures that only worsened their condition. The monastery's commitment to maintaining its public image of piety and order meant that the reality of widespread psychological distress among its members was carefully hidden from the outside world. Contrasting perspectives, the abbot's burden. While the common monk struggled with the crushing weight of monastic routine, the abbot existed in a different kind of prison, one gilded with authority but no less confining for its privileges. Abbot Thurston of Rievaulx understood the irony of his position better than most. He had sought the contemplative life as a young man, driven by genuine spiritual yearning, only to find himself decades later managing what was essentially a medieval corporation, complete with political intrigue, financial pressures, and the constant threat of scandal. From his private chambers, a luxury that would have seemed paradoxical to the monks sleeping on straw in the dormitory, Thurston could observe the daily struggles of his brothers with a mixture of sympathy and detached calculation. He knew which monks were losing their grip on sanity, which ones were engaging in forbidden practices, and which ones were simply counting the days until death would release them from their vows. But his knowledge came with the burden of responsibility for maintaining the monastery's reputation and financial stability. The abbot's day began, like that of his monks, with the bell for matins, but his participation in the daily prayers was often more performance than devotion. He sat in the ornate abbot's stall, a carved wooden throne that elevated him above his brothers both literally and symbolically, his mind occupied not with the Latin words flowing from his lips, but with the practical concerns that would occupy his day. Brother Marcus had been caught talking to himself again. Would he need to be removed from the scriptorium? The harvest from the monastery's lands had been poor this year. Would they need to reduce the already meager rations? The bishop would be visiting next month. Which of the more obviously disturbed brothers would need to be kept out of sight? After the service, while his monks dispersed to their labors, Thurston would retire to his study to wrestle with correspondence that revealed the monastery's precarious position in the wider world. Letters from Rome demanded greater financial contributions to support the Crusades. Local nobles threatened to reduce their donations unless the monastery provided more prayers for their deceased relatives. Merchant guilds complained about the quality of the manuscripts produced in the scriptorium, threatening to take their business elsewhere if standards didn't improve. The abbot's private knowledge of his monks' psychological states created a constant ethical dilemma. He knew that Brother Adelard's increasingly erratic behavior was a sign of mental breakdown, but he also knew that removing him from his duties would create a dangerous precedent. Other monks might begin to see madness as an escape from their obligations, so he chose to ignore the warning signs, hoping that Adelard would either recover or deteriorate quietly without disrupting the monastery's routine. The wealth that accumulated in the abbot's quarters, fine vestments, illuminated manuscripts, silver chalices, served not as personal luxuries, but as symbols of the monastery's success in the eyes of its wealthy patrons. Yet these very symbols of achievement created a psychological burden that was perhaps heavier than the physical hardships endured by the common monks. Thurston found himself becoming increasingly isolated from the spiritual life he had originally sought, his days consumed by administrative duties that left little time for prayer or contemplation. The abbot's relationship with the outside world also presented unique psychological challenges. Unlike his cloistered brothers, who had severed most connections with secular society, Thurston was required to maintain relationships with bishops, nobles, and merchants who represented everything the monastic life was supposed to reject. He attended banquets where he was expected to engage in political conversations while maintaining his religious authority. He negotiated business deals that required him to display worldly cunning while preserving his reputation for spiritual wisdom. These interactions with the secular world created a form of cognitive dissonance that was different from but no less destructive than the mental struggles of his monks. Thurston began to see himself as fundamentally different from both his brothers and the secular authorities he dealt with, neither fully committed to the monastic ideal nor capable of embracing worldly pleasures. He existed in a liminal space that offered the benefits of neither world while imposing the restrictions of both. The abbot's private chambers became a refuge from this psychological pressure, but they also became a symbol of his separation from the community he was supposed to lead. He would spend hours alone, reading books that his monks were forbidden to see, drinking wine that was prohibited to his brothers, and wrestling with doubts about the entire monastic enterprise that he could never voice aloud. The contrast between the abbot's private comfort and his monk's suffering created a perverse dynamic within the monastery. The brothers who glimpsed the abbot's private quarters during their serving duties would return to their cold dormitory with a mixture of resentment and envy that poisoned their already strained relationships with their spiritual father. Some began to suspect that the abbot's apparent piety was merely a performance, that his calls for greater devotion and self-denial were hypocritical pronouncements from someone who had exempted himself from the very sacrifices he demanded of others. This suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Thurston had indeed begun to question the value of the extreme asceticism that was slowly destroying his monks' minds and bodies. He had observed that the most psychologically stable members of his community were often those who found ways to moderate the harsh demands of monastic life, who ate slightly better food, slept more comfortably, or maintained clandestine friendships that provided emotional support. But acknowledging this reality would have undermined the entire theological framework that justified the monastery's existence. The abbot's burden was perhaps most evident in his relationship with the monastery's mad monks. While the common brothers could simply avoid their disturbed colleagues, Thurston was required to make decisions about their care and treatment. He had to balance compassion for their suffering with concern for the monastery's reputation and the spiritual well-being of the remaining brothers. When Brother Adelard finally broke down completely, Thurston faced an impossible choice: acknowledge that the monastic life itself might be responsible for his condition, or maintain the fiction that his madness was a spiritual trial sent by God. The abbot chose the latter option, as his predecessors had done, and as his successors would continue to do. He ordered special prayers for Adelard's recovery and instructed the brothers to treat his condition as a form of divine testing rather than a failure of the monastic system. But in the privacy of his chambers, Thurston began to compile a secret record of similar cases, documenting the psychological casualties of monastic life with a clinical detachment that belied his inner turmoil. This record, discovered centuries later among the monastery's archives, reveals a man who was acutely aware of the psychological damage being inflicted on his spiritual sons, but felt powerless to address it without undermining the entire institution he had sworn to protect. The abbot's position required him to be simultaneously the guardian of his monks' souls and the architect of their suffering, a paradox that eventually claimed his own mental stability. In his final years, Thurston began to display symptoms that mirrored those of his most disturbed monks. He would be found wandering the monastery at night, muttering prayers to saints who had never existed, convinced that he was receiving divine instructions to reform the entire monastic system. His successor, chosen by the surviving brothers, inherited not only the practical challenges of monastic administration, but also the psychological legacy of a man who had been slowly driven mad by the weight of his own authority. The contrast between the abbot's privileged position and his ultimate fate illustrates the fundamental paradox of medieval monastic life. Whether high or low in the monastery's hierarchy, whether living in comfort or suffering in poverty, all who entered those stone walls faced the same essential challenge: maintaining their sanity while pursuing an ideal that seemed to demand its sacrifice. As our journey through these ancient corridors draws to a close, we find ourselves back in the present moment, surrounded by the comforts that would have seemed miraculous to brothers Adelard, Anselm, and Thurston. The soft bed beneath you, the freedom to speak your thoughts aloud, the simple pleasure of choosing when to eat and what to consume, these are gifts that the medieval monk could hardly imagine. The monastery walls that once echoed with the sound of prayer bells now stand silent, their stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain. The men who walked these halls, who struggled with madness and found strange solace in their suffering, have long since returned to the earth they once knelt upon in prayer. Their stories remain as a testament to the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go in pursuit of meaning, and to the terrible price that such pursuit can exact. Perhaps in their struggles we find not judgment, but understanding. a recognition that the human need for purpose and transcendence is so powerful that it can drive us to create conditions that test the very limits of our psychological endurance. The monastery was both sanctuary and prison, both heaven and hell, both the height of spiritual achievement and the depths of human folly. Rest now, knowing that your dreams are your own to choose, your thoughts free to wander where they will, and your tomorrow filled with possibilities that no bell will dictate. The silence that surrounds you is not the enforced quiet of religious discipline, but the peaceful stillness of a mind at ease, ready to drift into sleep without the weight of centuries pressing down upon it. Sleep well, and let the gentle rhythm of your breathing carry you far from those ancient stones, into dreams that are yours alone to experience.